Hello everyone and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists episode 57. This time I'm going to be talking about Dictator Dan and Premier Plebiscite in Queensland and what's been happening in the COVID panic that has been going on. Now, first of all, I'm going to talk about Queensland. Now, I know someone who knows somebody who lives in what's called the border bubble. Now, if you're in Queensland, you can travel anywhere within Queensland. And if you're in New South Wales, you can travel anywhere within New South Wales, but you can't cross the border. The Queensland government has closed the Queensland-New South Wales border. So what about those people who actually live on the border? Well, there's what's called the border bubble. And if you live within the border bubble, then you can travel across the state line, but you can't leave the bubble. And if you do, then you have to stay in quarantine for 14 days. So we have a man in New South Wales. He suffered an injury. Now, it's not life-threatening, but it stops him from working. So it's obviously important that he gets medical care, and he needs an operation. So he lives near the town of Goondiwindi, which is right on the border between New South Wales and Queensland. And normally, if someone in Goondiwindi gets sick or injured, then they go to Toowoomba. And Toowoomba is about... sorry, I have this up. Where are we? Here we go. It's about 220 kilometres. So they go there, and there's a pretty good hospital there. And if they need to, then they can go to Brisbane. And Brisbane's another 125 kilometres or so. So that's what normally happens. But because of the border lockdown, he was refused permission to go into Queensland. So then he said, well, all right, well, I'll go to Moree. So that's about 130 kilometres. I'm going to be rounding off these numbers. 130 kilometres from Goondiwindi. His sister lives in Moree, and she said, listen, I'll come up and I'll pick you up and I'll take you down to Moree. So that's 130 kilometres one way and 130 kilometres back. That's 260 kilometres just so he can go to the hospital. And he goes to the hospital and they said, listen, we'd like to help you, but we're a small hospital. We don't have the specialists that you need. So you should go to Tamworth. So they get back in the car and they head to Tamworth, another 250 kilometres away. So they get to Tamworth, and Tamworth says, yeah, we've got the specialists, but we're not your local hospital. You should have gone to your local hospital. And they said, well, where's that? And they said, well, you should have gone to Dubbo. So Dubbo's another 250 kilometres away from Tamworth. But they didn't send them to Dubbo. They instead said, listen, we can do the operation, but we have to. We can only do it when there's space available. So, go home and we'll let you know when you can come in. So they drive from Tamworth back to Moree. That's 250 additional kilometres. About a week later, they get a call from the Tamworth hospital, and they said, oh, listen, we've scheduled your operation. It's in Newcastle. So Moree to Newcastle, that's another 500 kilometres. So the sister, who was doing all the driving, drives him from Moree down to Newcastle. Gets to Newcastle, and they said, listen, we can admit you, we can do the operation. It's going to be a couple of days, so I'm not sure exactly the terminology they used, but they implied that it was going to be, he was going to be in hospital for a week or something like that. So the sister said, hey, I've got things I can do back home. So she got back in the car and she drove from Newcastle back to Moree, another 500 kilometres. 2 days later, she gets a telephone call. They say, oh, you should come down to Newcastle and pick up your brother. He's ready to go. All right. So she gets in the car. She drives down to Newcastle, another 500 kilometres. And then, of course, once he's in the car, they turn around and head back to Moree, where he's going to recover because he can't go back into the bubble. All right. So that's a total of 2,750 kilometres driven in, 2 weeks? Just so this guy can get an injury looked at and surgery performed on it. Right? Now, the actual surgery was done pretty quickly, and 2 days later he's out of hospital. He's available to go do whatever he wants to do. And I was the person who told me this. So I know this story secondhand, but the person who told me this, they said, that's like driving from Melbourne to Brisbane. And I thought, oh, is it really that long? And I found out that it's actually Melbourne to Cairns. So Melbourne to far north Queensland is what they travelled in 2 weeks because they weren't allowed to go to Toowoomba Hospital. So that's kind of some of the nonsense that's going on around the country. And then we have Victoria, where the Premier, Dan Andrews, has earned the moniker Dictator Dan. And every day it's becoming a bit harder not to view that as accurate. He shut down the state twice. Effectively, we're under house arrest. They use nicer language, but you can only leave your house for 2 hours. And for the first six weeks of the lockdown, you could only leave it for 1 hour. And you can't go further than 5 kilometres from your house. That includes driving. And if you have to go more than 5 kilometres, you have to have a valid reason. And if that reason is work or school, you actually have to have a letter from the government issued by the police that you can show to them when they pull you over. So this is some of the strongest restrictions that we've ever had in Australia. And it's a technical question. Is this tougher than 1942 when we were under threat of invasion? And actually, in some ways, this is tougher. People weren't locked up in their house. People weren't told they weren't allowed to walk the streets. We have a curfew. It was 8 p.m. Now it's 9 p.m. Finishes at 5 a.m. There was no curfew during World War II, right? We were under threat of invasion, but there was no curfew because people actually had lives. But apparently, in 2020, we don't have lives. So that's a big change from how things used to be. Now, I have some articles that I've come up. All of these come from news.com.au, and basically I've just used them as the one source instead of going to multiple sources. There's one article here about coronavirus death toll United States, grim COVID-19 prediction few believed. When this number of deaths were forecast 5 months ago, few believed it would come to pass. Today it has, but dire modelling predicts it will double. And what's the number? The number's 200,000. So I go to a site called World Meters, and they have a coronavirus update every day. It's actually been quite good, and it's been up for months, 6 months. And there have been 200,000 deaths, 204,118 deaths as of yesterday, which is Sunday the 20th. So it's reached that 200,000 point. But at the same time, the Centre for Disease Control has said that the actual number of people who have died only from COVID-19 is about 10,000. So that puts the rate of people who have died just from COVID-19 without any other complications from any other disease at about 5% of those who have died, not those who have caught it. About 7 million people in the United States have actually had the disease. 4,250,000 have recovered, and 2.5 million are still active. They're still sick, or at least they have the virus, but they have neither died nor recovered. But of course, most people aren't dying, and we all know this. It's 8 months since this nonsense started. 22nd of January 2020 is when the world decided that this was a big issue. And, maybe in the early days, maybe I can look back and say, there was a valid reason. But I must say that never did I think there was a valid reason. The whole time I thought that this was scaremongering. And, hey, it's still going. Dictator Dan. I was listening to something on YouTube, and it was Andrew Bolt. Andrew Bolt is a newspaper columnist who writes for the Herald Sun, and apparently he is Australia's most read columnist. And he has been for a long time, probably about 15 years or so, maybe 20 years. And he's said in this YouTube clip that the most bizarre thing that he's seen in his lifetime is the cult of Dan. And Dan Andrews certainly has developed a bit of a cult following. And I think it actually predates the COVID panic. But he was returned last year was it the year before, in a landslide election. He was the government who came back to government with even more seats than he'd gone into the election with. So obviously there are a lot of people out there who like him. And I remember he used to be quite a big man, overweight. Not massively, but, enough to notice. And he's really trimmed down. He looks a lot better than he used to. But I think the secret of his success, there are two secrets. The first one is that he very much reminds me of John Cain. Now, if you're 40 or over and you're in Victoria, you'll certainly remember John Cain. If you're younger, you've probably never heard of him, or overseas. But he was the Labor Premier of Victoria in the 1980s. Now, his father, who had the same name, was also Premier of Victoria in the 1940s, but the son was much more successful. The son was in office for about 8 years, and he actually had a lot in common with Dan Andrews. And for those who are overseas, I would equate Dan Andrews in style to Barack Obama. And all three of them are men who are very they're very precise in how they speak. They're very calm. They don't get upset by things, or at least they don't appear to get upset by things. Everything is calm and measured, and a lot of people like that. A lot of people really find that attractive in a leader. But of course, as we know, Barack Obama, he spoke very nicely, but often the ideas behind his words were really bad, even evil. And that's also true of John Cain and Dan Andrews. They sound very nice and pleasant, but often what's behind those words is not nice or pleasant. Now, the second way that Dan Andrews reminds me of John Cain is John Cain bankrupted the state. He drove us into bankruptcy. And in the first decade of the 20th century, Victoria set up its own state savings bank called the State Bank of Victoria. And that was a major bank in Victoria throughout the 20th century. And then in 1989, the bank was sold because the state was bankrupt and it needed cash. So the bank was sold to the Commonwealth Bank, which at that time was still government owned It was owned by the Australian Commonwealth Government. And then it was privatised itself in 1992, and now it's a private bank on the stock market. Now, when you have to sell off your state-owned bank, I think that really gives an idea of how bad economically things were. Things were just disastrous. And it took 4 or 5 years for the state to recover. And myself, I never recovered from it. So there's always a big price for these economic downturns. But what reminds me of reminds me of the similarities between Dan Andrews and John Cain is that John Cain was popular not just because of his mannerisms, but also because he seemed to be doing things. And he did do things. He spent money. He spent a lot of money. He borrowed a lot of money. So a lot of people for a long time were very, very happy with John Cain because he gave them what they wanted. And then what always happens? The day of reckoning. There was a day of reckoning, and his career was destroyed, and the state of Victoria had a very, very unpleasant time. Dan Andrews also likes to spend money. And there's a lot of people who are very, very happy with Dan Andrews. But the day of reckoning will come. The day when we realise, hey, we've been right royally screwed. And maybe that's not as far away as we'd like to think. I'm looking at another article here. Where are you? All right, so I found the article that I was looking for, and it is Job Seeker, Job Keeper changes from September 25 may cause economic collapse. In the dark days of late March, the situation was dire for many Australians. Lines were out the door and around the block at Centrelink offices across the nation, and there were predictions that as many as 3.4 million people faced the prospect of becoming unemployed in the coming months. In the end, it was about 1 million people. As a result of the severity of the challenge facing the economy, the Morrison government instituted an unparalleled level of support for households and businesses. The JobKeeper program was introduced, providing $750 per employee per week to any business that could prove a large reduction in overall turnover, with different criteria for small and large business to qualify. According to Treasury estimates, in the following months, over 900,000 businesses and more than 3.5 million workers were supported by the JobKeeper program. The Job Seeker coronavirus supplement was also introduced, effectively doubling or more fortnightly unemployment payments for recipients. At a cost of $70 billion over 6 months, the JobKeeper program has provided over $2.6 billion in wage subsidies each week to qualifying businesses. In fact, JobKeeper ended up providing so much extra cash to businesses, the company profits for the June quarter jumped 15%. This occurred despite the fact that the June quarter was the height of the various lockdowns and restrictions across the nation. But in the coming weeks, this enormous level of government assistance will begin to come to an end. In 8 days, the scaffold of support for business provided by JobKeeper will start to be gradually removed. From September 25, the JobSeeker maximum fortnightly rate for a single household will drop from $1,110 to $810, while JobKeeper will be reduced to at most $600 a week from September 28. This will mean hundreds of thousands of businesses are forced to stand on their own 2 feet for the first time in 6 months, and approximately 1.3 million workers will lose access to support from the JobKeeper program. According to a survey by business performed by research firm Digital Finance Analysis, DFA, small and medium business owners are quite guarded about their prospects going forward, with around 1 in 4 of those surveyed stating that given the circumstances, they do not expect to be trading in 6 months' time. 1 in every 4 businesses in Australia is expected to close. In Victoria, almost 35% of businesses surveyed stated they did not expect to be trading in 6 months' time. So in the rest of Australia, 1 in 4 businesses. In Victoria, 1 in 3. Now, of course, it depends on the industry. Transport and warehousing has actually done quite well. And only about 10% say that they expect to close within 6 months. In education and training, accommodation, food services, they expect half of businesses to close. So arts and recreation is also in that. There are areas of the economy that are just going to be devastated. And of course, this was always going to be. We have to understand that the job seeker and job keeper payments were really just kicking the can down the road, and that people think that this year has been bad, but actually I think next year is going to be even worse. Victorian businesses are doing it particularly tough, with the data from DFA analysts also show that small and medium businesses in the state recording a huge 12.6% drop in employment. 12.5% drop in employment. That's a big kick. And the government has taken out loans. Every government has taken out loans because they're so cheap at the moment, and they think that's a good thing. That's a really bad thing, because as soon as they start going up again, well, we're stuck with that interest rate. Yeah, it's all bad. A week ago, regional Victoria was pretty much opened up, but Melbourne is still under lockdown, so it's a bit hard to get anything done in Melbourne. But regional Australia regional Victoria has not quite returned to normal in terms of what they can do, but things are better than they were. But you can't travel between Melbourne and regional Victoria, so we're still in isolation. We're still not allowed to travel out, and if you do travel out of Melbourne and you're caught, then you'll receive a $4,957 fine. Now, people always ask, why are the fines such bizarre numbers? Well, the reason is that fines are worked out on what's called a unit cost. And when the units were first instituted, they were round numbers. And now, over time, as inflation has come in, they're not round numbers. So you add them together and you get bizarre things like $4,957. Now, apparently, up to 20 Melburnians have been fined $4,900. Somewhere between 40 and 50 people have been fined in the last few weeks, $1,652. So that generally means that they were more than 5 kilometres from their home. And, we've started to have protests now. People are getting together and protesting, and the police have done nothing to help their reputation. The Victoria Police's reputation, which I remember was very high, once upon a time in the 80s, people regarded the Victoria Police as incorruptible, and now you look back at it and you think, oh wow, we were a bit naive, but their reputation was that high, and now you see them walking around basically dressed like RoboCop, and you think to yourselves, you're not on our side. You're a foreign occupation. You're just occupiers. And when the police lose the support of the right, who are they going to turn to? It's all very short-sighted. Everything is very short-sighted. I have another article that I wanted to read to you, which also highlights just how bad things are here. Coronavirus Victoria. Police order law professor and elderly mother to keep walking. Now, I'll actually read the entire article because there are bits and pieces of it that are very good. A Melbourne University law professor says she feels Victoria's heavy-handed enforcement of coronavirus restrictions is doing lasting damage to Australian society. Caddy Barnett has spoken out after her own run-in with police last week and has written to her local Member of Parliament about her concerns. Professor Barnett, 45, has cerebral palsy and requires injections into her feet to stop her muscles cramping. Per doctor's orders, she is supposed to go for walks after receiving the injections. Last Tuesday, she was on a walk with her 70-year-old mother, who has a double hip replacement. When, after about 1 kilometre, the pair stopped for a rest and a coffee, that's when the police came up and said, "You have to move on. You're not allowed to stop walking." Professor Barnett told news.com.au. I said, "You're kidding, right?" He said, "No. You need to keep walking and head back to your house." As a lawyer, part of her wanted to argue with the police, but she didn't want to get her mother in trouble as well by shooting my mouth off. So we walked very slowly up the hill, she said. Professor Barnett, whose expertise is in commercial rather than criminal law, said the incident left her upset. "Not so much for myself, I can deal with it," she said. "If they find me, I would have fought it in court. I was upset for other people who are vulnerable, people who aren't legally trained, who might just think, 'Oh God, I've broken the law.'" Earlier this month, Victoria Police were filmed telling a heavily pregnant woman she was not allowed to sit down at a park bench to rest during her permitted 1 hour of outdoor exercise. That came after another video of officers surrounding and arresting 2 elderly women sitting on a park bench went viral. Professor Barnett said Victoria's public health directives were very broad-textured and basically allow police discretion in how to enforce them. "I read the directives. There's absolutely nothing said about stopping while walking," she said. "My difficulty is it leaves quite a lot of discretion in the hands of those officers and also depends on the reasonableness of the particular officer." She suggests Victoria Police and the state government have lost sight of the ultimate purpose of the restrictions, which is to stop COVID-19 transmission. Instead, the rules are being enforced for the rule's sake, even if there is clearly no risk. If there is a person in a park without a mask on and there's no one within a kilometre, for God's sake, let it go, she said. Something I always say to my students is, never forget what it's all about. Why are we doing this? Professor Barnett says she doesn't object to the coronavirus restrictions or Daniel Angel's government per se, but the way they are being enforced. "I don't care if it's a Liberal or a Labor government doing this, it makes no difference," she said. "Any government has to be careful because this actually brings the law into disrepute. If people see a well-intentioned law being enforced in a way that doesn't make sense, it undermines the ultimate purpose of the law and makes people not take it seriously." Michael Collins, I should have done this off air, checked it out. Michael Kozilny, a former Victoria police officer and now criminal defence lawyer, said there had been some quite alarming policing since the start of the pandemic. "We've got an excellent and balanced police force these days, but there's quite a handful of idiots in it who don't exercise discretion," he said. "Especially now when we're all going through difficult times. We're all financially challenged. It's not just about getting a booking." He has had one client, a young apprentice, fined $2,000 because he forgot his work permit at home. That's right, you get charged. Others have come to him after being fined for coming home 15 minutes after 8 p.m. In saying that, there have been a whole bunch of stories where police have exercised their discretion and done a wonderful job, he said. Mr. Kalinsky, who spent 10 years on the force, said at first police might have been unhappy with the new laws, but to tell you the truth, now I think they enjoy it. As one of the senior officers mentioned a couple of weeks ago, this is great. Even the crooks are staying home, he said. From a police point of view, they would probably like the curfew to stay forever. But Mr. Kalinsky stressed that he thought Mr. Andrews and Chief Health Officer Professor Brett Sutton had done a courageous and heroic job. I think it's a terrific police force, but there's a handful of idiots that shouldn't be in the job that have abused their power, he said. It comes as former Victorian Liberal Party President Michael Kroger claims Victoria is seeing what fascism looks like. Mr. Kroger was commenting on sweeping new powers that will allow the government to deny anyone deemed a high risk of spreading COVID-19. Now you are having people who are not police officers being given the power to arrest people, he told Sky News. This is a shocking state of affairs in Victoria, and now people are seeing what it's like to have a really fascist left-wing government, and that's what we have in Victoria, quite frankly. Conservative think tank the Institute of Public Affairs has declared Victoria a police state, and even the left-leaning Washington Post has labelled Mr. Andrews a dictator. Asked if she thought the term police state was going too far, Professor Barnett said it depends what happens next. I'm a lawyer. I don't like hyperbole. I'm not going on about Dictator Dan or COVID idiots or police states. I don't buy into any of that, she said. We have to be measured, step back and wait and see a bit. Part of the problem is lack of nuance in the debate, she said, with both sides using straw man arguments to tar the opposition with the most extreme fringe views. When she first raised concerns last week, Professor Barnett says some people asked whether she was a sovereign citizen. I had to say, no, I'm a law professor. If I'm speaking out about it, I must be Bunnings Masked Woman. I'm so far from Bunnings Masked Woman, you can't imagine. Professor Barnett said her great concern, which she wrote to a Member of Parliament about, was the effect on state capability, or the notion that the government is generally competent and therefore trusted. One thing I've always been proud of in Australia is we have high state capacity, she said. My view is that it's being eroded in Australia and it's going to have to be restored. The way things are going isn't great. She warns the heavy-handed policing is undermining the law, respect for police and the government. There are people who still think everything that's happening is fine, but the number who don't is growing. I mean, that's quite remarkable. And actually, she's quite right. You know, it is undermining the law. It is undermining respect for the police, and it is undermining the government, both and the Labor Party. There are people who are still going along with it. People who 8 months into this panic are still talking about how, you know, we can't open up the economy because, you know, all these old people will die. And as of today, we've got 851 total deaths in Australia. Total cases, 26,900. Total cases recovered, 24,100. You know, it's so over the top. It's just absurd. Now, at the start, when I was talking about how long this particular woman had driven her brother, and she obviously loves her brother, because she drove an enormous amount of distance, and I said it was Melbourne to Cairns. You might not know Australian geography if you're not in Australia, but that's basically Paris to Moscow. So in 2 weeks, she drove from Paris to Moscow so that her brother could get an operation and took him home. Now, on that point, I think I might finish up. Thank you for listening. If you would like to support my work, you can go to Subscribestar and help me out there. And apologies for being a bit late this week, but hopefully we'll be back on track next week. All right, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.